On April 2, 2025, President Trump delivered what he called a Liberation Day speech in the Rose Garden, marking a new phase in his protectionist trade strategy. In his announcement, he outlined a two-tier tariff system, a baseline 10% duty on imports from nearly every country, and additional country-specific reciprocal tariffs based on what his administration deems unfair trade practices. Here's a graph to show you the tariff rates based off of the reciprocal tariffs. Here, on the graph, you can see a number of Asian economies that received steep tariffs. You can see China, which was slapped with over 34%, Vietnam at over 46%, and even Japan, which has long been one of America's greatest allies, yet it was slapped with over 24% in tariff rates. And one of these Asian economies that were slapped with steep tariffs is no other than Taiwan. Here, you can see that Taiwan didn't just receive similar tariffs to Japan or South Korea, it received one of the highest among Asian economies. Taiwan received tariff rates of over 32%, nearly comparable to China. This enormous tariff rate has been a cause for concern among many observers and analysts. Why? That's because Taiwan relies extensively on US exports. Taiwan supplies some of the most important components in the global tech supply chain, especially semiconductors. Companies like TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, ship billions of dollars worth of chips to the US, powering everything from smartphones to fighter jets. And these billions of dollars worth of exports have not only been important for Taiwan as of recent years, it has been true for many, many years. If we graph out Taiwan's biggest export market in 2023, we get to see that the United States is the second largest market for Taiwanese exports. For that year, Taiwan exported over $85.6 billion to the United States, which is 16.8% of Taiwan's total exports for that year. That's no small figure. But what's far more important for you to understand isn't just about the amount of export value they bring to the United States, but also how fast the United States is growing in comparison to China, and their trade balance. Let's first talk about the growing importance of US trade to Taiwan. Over the past few years, the United States has actually become a much more important destination for Taiwanese exports. Let's graph out the exports of Taiwan to the United States by year. Here on the graph, you can see just how big of an increase Taiwanese exports are to the United States. In 2019, Taiwan only exported $54.2 billion to the United States, but just 5 years later, by 2024, it had more than doubled to over $116 billion. This is no small figure, and it goes to show just how important the United States has become for Taiwan. And what's more important is that Taiwan isn't actually seeing that big of an increase for their exports to China. Here's a graph on Taiwan's exports to both China and Hong Kong. Here, one can easily see that it is the exact opposite of their exports to the United States. You can see that in 2019, Taiwan exported over $132 billion to China and Hong Kong, and by 2024, it reached over $150 billion. That's not really a big increase in 5 years, and definitely not as big as an increase when compared to their exports to the United States. The reason? Well, that's because Taiwan has been slowly diversifying away from its economic reliance on China. Tensions across the Taiwan Strait, from political threats to military posturing, have pushed Taiwanese companies and policymakers to reduce their exposure to China. Many firms have adopted a China Plus One strategy, shifting operations or building closer relationships with alternative markets like the US, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, the United States has been actively strengthening its trade and investment ties with Taiwan, especially in advanced technology. Washington has encouraged companies like TSMC to invest in chip plants on US soil, such as the $40 billion facility being built in Arizona. This mutual dependence, the US on Taiwanese tech and Taiwan on US demand, has deepened trade ties rapidly. Unfortunately, under Donald Trump's administration, the economic partnership between Taiwan and the United States has become a double-edged sword. The reason is simply because of the tariff rates that Trump pursued. When Taiwan exports goods to the United States, they are usually at a trade surplus. That basically means Taiwan sells more to the US than it buys. And under Trump's America First philosophy, trade surpluses, even with close allies, are seen as a problem. To show you how this works, let's graph out the trade balance of the United States to Taiwan. This graph shows you just how much the United States has been importing from Taiwan compared to how much it exports. In 2020, the US trade deficit with Taiwan was around $30.2 billion. But 4 years later, it has grown massively to over $73.9 billion. This deficit is what caused Trump to initiate such steep tariff rates on Taiwan. And the impacts of these steep tariff rates is much worse than you think. If we graph out Taiwan's trade balance, we get to see that it is mostly positive, meaning Taiwan generally exports more than it imports. This then helps Taiwan build its foreign reserves and maintain a strong and stable currency. By building foreign reserves, Taiwan actually became one of the largest holders of US debt, also known as US Treasury. This means Taiwan plays an important role in helping finance the US government. If we graph out the largest holders of US Treasuries, we get to see that, as of January 2025, Taiwan holds a massive $290.4 billion, which puts them above countries like South Korea, Germany, Mexico, and a long list of other economies. And indeed, one of the reasons for this massive holdings of foreign reserves and US Treasuries is no other than their ability to have a positive trade balance. And that's where the danger lies. It's in fact that if Taiwan were to lose this trade surplus, then its ability to accumulate foreign reserves, and by extension continue purchasing US Treasuries, would be severely impacted. In other words, steep tariffs from the US don't just risk hurting Taiwan's exports, they also threaten to weaken one of America's own financial backers. One can evidently see just how bad Taiwan's economy would be if we look at the stock market. Here's a graph on the MSCI Taiwan, which is a major index that tracks the performance of the largest and most influential publicly listed companies in Taiwan, especially those in the tech and semiconductor sectors. Here, you can see that on Trump's Liberation Day, April 2nd, the MSCI Taiwan opened at 882, but just a few days later, it dropped significantly to over 793. A nearly 90-point drop in just a few days represents billions of dollars in lost value. Investors clearly saw Trump's tariffs not as a manageable policy shift, but as a direct threat to Taiwan's export-heavy economy, especially its prized semiconductor industry. So, this raises the question, will Taiwan actually survive US tariffs, or will it badly hurt their economy? The answer is quite a mix. For the most part, Taiwan's prized industry, its semiconductors, isn't actually going to receive tariffs. Indeed, semiconductors are exempt from tariffs, and it is only applied to other goods. And this is where we can make a good argument as to why Taiwan's trade balance with the US won't actually drop that big. Semiconductors, as many of you may know, are a big part of Taiwan's economy. They are the world's largest producer of semiconductors, especially advanced chips. In fact, Taiwan's TSMC alone is responsible for over 50% of the global foundry market and more than 90% of the most advanced chips used in high-performance computing, AI, and smartphones. That's not just dominance, that's near total global dependence. So, if Trump were to raise tariffs on these chips, then it wouldn't just be Taiwan that suffers, it would be the entire world. US companies like Apple, Nvidia, AMD, and even defense contractors rely heavily on TSMC's chips to manufacture their products. A 32% tariff would dramatically increase costs for these firms, forcing them to either absorb the loss or pass it on to consumers. That could mean more expensive phones, computers, cars, and even military equipment. To show you just how reliant the United States is to Taiwan's semiconductor exports, here's a graph on the exports of Taiwan to the US. By category, Here, you can see that there's only two categories that really take up the bulk of Taiwan's exports to the United States, and that is machinery and mechanical appliances, as well as electrical equipment. These two categories make up a staggering nearly 79% of Taiwan's total exports to the United States. And what do these two categories mostly include? You guessed it, semiconductors and advanced electronics. So, in essence, Trump's tariffs won't actually affect the bulk of Taiwan's exports. It would only affect the smaller industries like food. In this case, we can now see that Taiwan's economy would indeed still stand strong despite Trump's tariffs, as they still maintain dominance in the sectors that matter most, semiconductors and high-tech manufacturing. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.